Right. Hey everyone, and welcome to this seminar, which will be a little bit different than the other ones because it will be split into two distinct parts. One about whether the global economy will see a smooth landing or crash, with some reflections on the remarks of Larry Summers. And then the second part about human capital under FPOS Mark II. So first, influential US economist Larry Summers has recently criticized the US Federal Reserve for having so-called itchy fingers to start cutting rates and for underestimating the so-called neutral rate at 2.6%, where I think it's important for everyone who's not familiar with the term the neutral rate to say that the neutral interest rate refers to the short-term interest rate that would prevail if the economy is close to full employment, while importantly, inflation is under control. So the Fed estimates the neutral rate is 2.6%, and it currently has an interest rate around 5%. So then the logical conclusion would be that the Fed would need to start cutting interest rates soon. But in light of US inflation once again increasing a little bit, especially when it comes to sticky price inflation, which is again a difficult term, which refers to prices that don't change that quickly, Larry Summers has now said in a Bloomberg interview that he sees enough evidence that the neutral interest rate is likely a bit high, quite a bit higher, I could say, than 2.6%. And therefore, the Federal Reserve should not decrease interest rates too quickly. And he gives four pieces of evidence for that. The first being that the US economy is still growing really, really fast, despite, the interest rates being quite far above what the Fed considers a neutral interest rate. He also says, second piece of evidence, that financial conditions, citing credit spreads and the fact that the stock market is on fire, basically. So financial conditions are really loose, again, despite these high interest rates. Then he also says that long-term forward market estimates of interest rates in the future are way higher than 4%. And finally, that some of the fundamentals, like a lot of government spending right now in the United States, for the purposes of industrial policy mainly, but also the fact that we're seeing deglobalization going on, like that could signal that there will be permanently higher inflation, and therefore the neutral interest rate should also be quite a bit higher. But so that's his evidence. But is he right? And importantly, does this apply to other economies than the United States, especially smaller open economies? Well, that is what Doug Lexton from the Better Policy Project and also some of his students, central bankers from the Global Forecasting School, will talk about. Specifically, after a introduction to all of this, Evie will talk about the role of central bank communications. She's from the Norges Bank and the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. And then Anna will do a case study of the Czech Central Bank. Sergey will do a case study of the Bank of England. Lasha about the ECB. And then Doug will tell us about the choice currently facing the Bank of Japan. So that's a lot to cover. Let's get into it. Doug, you have the floor.
Okay, so it was actually Larry Summers that used the word on the foothills of bubbles. Okay, and but he also mentioned the word crash and so on. And so we've been talking about this. We're not going to mince words here. The U.S. household balance sheet increased $45 trillion between the end of the first quarter of 2020 and the end of last year, and that was a result of a doubling of the S&P from 2,500 to 5,000, and a 50% increase in property prices and so on. So we think that there is a bubble now. Of course, if AI were to stimulate growth and so on, so there is, maybe there isn't a bubble. What we're worried about, and this is what I'm not going to be talking about today, but Miriam, one of our students, has estimated consumption functions where that wealth variable plays a significant role, and it can explain to a large extent why the U.S. economy has been ripping along and why consumption and domestic demand has been strong, in particular in the fourth quarter and the first quarter this year, and so on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the types of analysis that we do. We're going to consider in the global forecasting school various central banks, some of which are non-FPAS central banks, like the United Kingdom. So a lot of talk about the UK because of the Bernanke report and so on. But we're also going to talk about what we describe as FPAS Mark One central banks, like the Czech National Bank. So we have a couple students here at the end of my talk. They'll be talking about applying Mark II ideas to these other central banks and economies. This was really encouraged by Larry Summers, that told us we should go back and do as many counterfactuals as possible to kind of ask how would FPAS Mark II have helped in various times in the past and so on. And one time that we looked at, for example, was before the global financial crisis. Would FPAS Mark II have helped us to allow policymakers to express their concerns about potential financial instability leading up to the global financial crisis? But there are other periods in time, for example, like when the global financial crisis hit, where the Fed could have used more conventional forward guidance and less unconventional forward guidance of talking longer term interest rates and term premium down. So that's going to be a little bit part of the story, because we think that doing those kinds of policies during COVID may have contributed to a bubble. Okay, that I'm going to talk about. Now, if you want to look at the book, the draft of the prudent risk management approach to monetary policy that was created and launched in January of this year, you can find on the Better Policy Project website. There's also a couple dozen working papers there that explain the development of the framework and so on. We've, at this point, implemented it. And in March, we had the very first monetary policy report under FPAS Mark II. Just as a side, and looking at it a little bit, um, we we operate in this dynamic learning environment. So one of the various projects that we're working on is trying to improve the quality of charts and so on. So we have a couple of students, Deanna and Svetlana. My charts might not be up to their standards today, so this is work in progress, trying to get these charts looking good. I should also thank Bob Ford, who has been helping them develop standards, both for the monetary policy report, our website, uh, all kinds of documents that we want to try and improve and so on. Now, it's kind of funny because I was teaching Bayesian econometrics to two other students, Leah and Miriam. Leah will talk later. And in that discussion, we talked about the development of Bayesian methods and DSGE models. And and anyway, in in terms of telling that story about the history of model development, it's clear we made some mistakes, and there's clear that it was mainly men involved in making those mistakes. And so when we were reviewing this and asking why more women weren't involved in developing these frameworks, we came to the conclusion is that it's because women are more afraid of looking dumb and making silly mistakes than men. And so the idea is maybe it's time to give the women a chance at trying to solve some of these issues. So Leah is going to talk a little bit about this. Uh, Larry Summers, really since 2021, has been talking about these issues. And in many respects, it's like He's been reading a lot of the things that we've been talking about. I don't think so. I think he's probably thinking about many of those things independently. But in a lot of cases, when he says things, the students try to model them and kind of work out some of his reasoning and so on. So there's a number of things recently. The latest one is the one that we're going to talk about today, which is has the neutral interest rate increased. And so that turns out to be a really, really important issue for looking at things like fiscal sustainability and term premium and the probabilities of fiscal crises and financial crises and so on. And so that type of discussion about scenarios takes us away from our standard practice of just looking at what we describe as case A and case B scenarios, where we look at what's priced in financial markets in terms of the expected path of the policy rate, and then ask, are there some interesting and relevant assumptions about the economy and underlying inflation that could give rise to a higher expected path? And so we call that path with higher excess demand conditions and higher inflation and so on, case A, and we call paths for the expected Fed funds rate that's lower than what's priced in financial markets as case B, and so on. But we also allow for the possibility of case X and case Y scenarios. We don't typically generate all those types of scenarios or lines for those scenarios, but we think through it and sometimes we generate it. And the question is, when should we communicate those kinds of things? And the answer is quite obviously when policymakers are concerned about them and think that they need to pursue a strategy, a prudent risk management approach, or an approach that Olivier Blanchard would describe as avoiding dark corners. Okay, and so this is an idea based on financial fragilities and so on. So Evie, at the end of my discussion, will talk about some of these difficult communication issues. Maybe some of the issues are easier to communicate, but she will take a stab at those types of issues. I'm not going to get into it. I'm just going to talk about the economic issues and leave the communications to her. Okay, so the first thing is Yuri did a good job summarizing Larry's argument for why the neutral rate is higher. And the answer is underlying inflation isn't anywhere close to 2%. Now, this has been our view, and this has been a view embodied in our case A scenarios for a couple of years now, since 2021, because we look at this concept that we call sticky price inflation. The term's not the greatest. What we mean by that are prices of goods and services that are typically set infrequently. So in this case, we're using the Atlanta Fed definition where they're prices that are typically set 5 months or longer. So think of the price, setting the price of of a rental apartment, which would typically be a year and so on. So that type of thing. So we're distinguishing between flexible prices that are affected by idiosyncratic demand and supply shocks, but then in aggregate, like is always the case, um, lead underlying sticky price inflation when there's generalized excess demand conditions like there was during 2021, where we switched from excess supply conditions in 2022 to excess demand conditions and so on. And of course, that was related to highly expansionary monetary and fiscal policies that shifted aggregate demand out, but there were obviously issues or bottlenecks and supply did not shift out as much as demand. The Phillips curve became steeper. That's the analytical framework that we're using to think about it. It ended up being perfect during COVID. So our story is that excess demand conditions are still apparent in the labor market, still apparent in the goods market. And that is consistent with underlying sticky price inflation, currently around 4.5%, the last numbers. And as you can see in the chart, have started to tick up. So obviously, financial conditions are not tight enough. Now, another thing, and the chart that Larry Summers emphasized, and then that's been floating around social media, is basically looking at the forward curves and looking at the 5-year bond rate 10 years into the future. And that number is around 4 to 4.5% now. I thought that was kind of odd that people would be looking at that because conceptually that still includes a term premium. So that's not exactly the 5-year bond rate is not exactly the expected average path of the short-term policy rate. It conceptually it should be that plus a term premium. So there's an assumption in all of this chart that's floating around that was produced by Goldman Sachs that the term premium is zero. You could also just look at the data from options markets, which is reported every day by the Atlanta Fed in the Fed funds tracker, and you can see, which is interesting because if one goes back uh, a year ago, that number had a terminal rate of around 2.5%, exactly what's in the dot plot. And what's happened as the economy has continued to expand, there has been no recession, and underlying inflation, again, has not come down and now is starting to go up. Based on what Yuri's definition was about what the neutral rate is, you would infer that it is higher. Well, that's what's happening in financial markets in the sense that when we look at the expected path of the policy rate and we look at the end of 2026 in the chart, which should be the horizon that monetary policy should be, getting things back to normal. But just think of it as a proxy. It's also shifted up to 4%. So that's roughly consistent with the term premium in medium term maturity bond rates being zero, which is the case. But it's much better, I think, to look at this information than just to look at the forward curves because they are going to include term premium. And of course, now if those term premium are zero, that might be okay, but it's very important to understand the potential vulnerability of those term premium being zero, because some of the factors that I'm going to talk about could result in much higher term premium in the future. So I'm referring to government debt dynamics and stuff in a world of high interest rates. So the argument that Larry makes is based on this idea that interest rates aren't high enough to slow the economy down, and the economy is still overheating. But in addition to that, when one looks at financial markets, they have now priced in what looks like a 4% plus. He calls it a handle of four rather than 2.5, and that is a very significant development, as I'm going to argue, because that would certainly make the fiscal dynamics look much more onerous and so on. In addition, recently, the cut in the Fed funds rate in June is no longer expected. The charts that we have right now are from April 26, or they're a couple days old. Now the chances of a Fed cut in June are less than 10% and so on. So so basically the term structure is moving up. And one interpretation of that with the analytical framework that we have is that the neutral rate would be higher. Now, this is really important because one of the very first things that we do is to create what we describe as a market reference scenario, where we ask, so we take a model and then ask what assumptions would be required to be consistent with what's priced in financial markets. That's just used as a frame of reference, again, for helping us to construct our case A and our case B scenarios. But of course, it is a consistent way for thinking about creating baseline scenarios that are consistent with what's priced in financial markets. So when we think about this from the point of view of our analytical framework, how could the Fed funds rate be 4% at the end of 26? We would say the neutral rate is probably shifted up. And that, of course, is consistent with the idea that the US economy is not really slowing down enough to generate the excess supply to bring inflation back to the target. We look at numerous indicators. One of the favorite ones that we use for thinking about the monetary transmission mechanism. So we have a much more complicated views than the transmission mechanism going directly from the Fed funds rate to the economy. We also think about it going through banks. So we look at this Fed Senior Loan Officer Survey, and that is very important for important variable that we use. And as you can see, on the basis of past tightening in financial conditions, we've typically had recessions afterwards, and this time, no recession. And so the question is why? Well, if one looks at the other variable that we focus on when we think about macro financial linkages, we look at the BAA spread. Why BAA? Well, because it's a rate just below or just above junk bonds. And so that's a kind of a nice point in the distribution that historically has also been a good predictor of recessions when it's about to happen. And right now, when we look at that variable, BAA spreads, it's at an historical low, even lower than what we observed before the global financial crisis. And this is part of so financial conditions are actually pretty easy on the basis of these kinds of metrics. Now, they're tighter in the household sector, luckily, because banks are worried about putting things like longer term mortgages on their asset side of their balance sheet because they're concerned about higher interest rates. So the mortgage rates are actually pretty are pretty high, and I think are reasonably priced and stuff. But we have this problem that when one looks at financial markets, it looks frothy. Asset prices are really high, and the price of risk is really, really low. So this BAA spread is low. Now, you finish out the discussion of the economy. Growth has been higher than our estimates of potential. Could be our estimates of potential need to be revised up. You look at the latest estimates of GDP now. Again, this is for the second quarter. There's very little real data that are on the base of these estimates, big confidence intervals. But again, because consumption is strong, and that's connected to the consumption functions and the high asset prices and stuff, so this idea that domestic demand will remain strong is consistent with high asset prices. Now, it could be the case, and we consider scenarios where asset prices collapse. We get a 10, 20, 30, 40% correction in asset prices. And if that happens, then the dynamic of a recession could take hold, or a case B could be achieved, and so on. Now, how do we think about real interest rates? So I've already told you that based on the market, the expected value of the neutral short-term rate is 4%. What about longer-term rates? And here we're looking at real 10-year bond rates from the index bond market and giving you our interpretation of what we think is going on. This is partly based on work by HICAS, who's brought out our models to look at the effects of the run-up in world public debt that has happened since the global financial crisis If you have a non-Ricardian model, then obviously that big increase in government debt should be driving up the real neutral rate. Okay, so I want to, I just want to point that out. Now, how do we think about that? So, how do we think about the real 10-year bond rate? It's quite a bit different than the way Olivier Blanchard thinks about it. We don't see a declining downward trend here. We see a decline in the term premium on 10-year bond rates that decline basically to around zero and even negative values. That is related to work that I had done, as well as work by people at the Fed, such as Ingen, Laubeck, and Reichnetter, that basically argue that unconventional monetary policies, the combination of unconventional forward guidance and large scale asset purchases, drove these term premium down to zero. And the risk, of course, of that is that they might rise in the future. Okay, so when we go back to the history of this, and if we're going to use general equilibrium economics, full employment economics, we go back to a period like the Great Moderation before the global financial crisis, where the real interest rate was 2% on 10-year bonds and so on. And then we say, well, what happened after that? Well, we went to a period of unemployment where basically we couldn't get interest rates low enough, okay, to basically stimulate the economy to eliminate unemployment and so on. So what happened? We had unconventional monetary policies that drove term premium down. And the question is, will they bounce back? And under what situations might they bounce back? So that's the story. We have two working papers on the Better Policy Project website that basically go through these models, non-Ricardian models, global models of the world, and take that kind of global general equilibrium perspective and so on. So that's kind of the story. I'm not going to harp on any of these particular details because the plan is to get into the specifics of those things during our daily videos that the students put out. Now, why are we concerned about interest rates? Well, our current interest rates, even though they might have a 4% neutral rate, they have very low term premium. Okay, I'm not going to show you the estimates of those things because they're all over the map, and of course, the quality of the estimates will depend on the quality of the model and the quality of the data that are feeding into them. And so Voskin is going to do a seminar on that issue. I'm just going to tell you that most estimates are approximately zero now, and we should be concerned about that because the potential for them snapping back, like during the taper tantrum, is quite serious. And if they were to snap back, that would result in possibly the perception that debt dynamics might be unstable. Now, looking at the Congressional Budget Office's February projections, so we can see that in those projections, the 10-year bond rate was about 4.1%. Okay, so now I've already told you that if the neutral rate is 4%, and if the term premium were to snap back to kind of reasonable levels that would be consistent with even the Great Moderation, which would be about 1 percentage point, that would take 10-year bond rates up to 5%. So that'd be a full percentage point higher than what's currently assumed in the Congressional Budget Office projections. And that would make the debt dynamics with a primary deficit that's expected to be in the 2.5% to 3% range. That would make those debt dynamics much, much more explosive. And then the question is, at what point would there be a perception that the fiscal situation is not stable and so on? So the big issue when one looks at the political situation in the United States, is it likely that they will be able to adjust the primary deficit to a surplus, because that's what would be required to stabilize the higher and rising interest payments on the debt, with a debt to GDP ratio of 100% and rising and so on. So that's the big issue. At what point does that debt and that deficit result in a requirement by financial market participants to get some compensation for the risk that interest rates might rise in the future? Okay, the fear of basically making capital losses on your bond portfolio, which of course you saw during the period of financial fragility and so on. Now, so one can look at periods of financial crises. Um, one doesn't have to go back very far, just to the European debt crisis, and see that when one looks at countries like Italy, the point, this is on a monthly basis, on a daily basis, it would be a little bit higher than this, but during the European debt crisis, a 10-year bond rate of 7% was sufficient to satisfy the requirement that financial market participants knew that the debt dynamics weren't stable. In other words, they wouldn't be able to generate the primary surpluses in Italy. They wouldn't be able to raise taxes or cut expenditures to be able to control that debt process. So, of course, we all know what happened. There was the great Mario Draghi speech, where buried deep in the speech, he had the line, "We'll do whatever it takes." And that was enough to turn financial markets around, of course, with some things to back it up. But it was really the statement, and then some policy measures that. Now, how did they get into that problem? Well, we all know it was a very small problem. It was Greece. And if one thinks about how a small problem like that can get out of control when you're vulnerable, then one needs to think about that. Now, Europe does have a problem in the sense that they put a monetary union together without having a fiscal and political union, and so they have that issue that they don't have in countries like the United States, where they have one country and one monetary policy, a political union, a fiscal union, and a monetary union. So that makes Europe quite a bit different than other countries. But it's a concern because there are high debt countries in Europe, like Italy. Debt has risen since the European debt crisis. That means that the critical threshold for interest rates, where fiscal dynamics would perceive to be unstable, that critical threshold for interest rates has declined. And so the question is, how much can the ECB allow interest rates to rise in Europe if they were to rise in the rest of the world, such as in the United States? So we have vulnerabilities in Europe. We also have a comment last night in X um, by Robin. Oh my lord, Robin. Can't remember. It's terrible, terrible, terrible. But he argued in his blog that Japan now is concerned about raising interest rates given the really high levels of debt. And of course, this is resulting in a lot of upward pressure in the Japanese yen. So 10-year bond rates in Japan are below 1%. 10-year bond rates in the United States are approaching 5%. So there's a 4 percentage point differential. And of course, that means that the Japanese yen has to depreciate to the point where people expect an appreciation over time for arbitrage to hold and stuff. And so the Japanese authorities last night drew the line at 160 euro. So they intervened and so on. And that was later verified that they spent somewhere between 30 and I think 50 billion. The article is in the Financial Times, and you probably want to check the numbers. Now, this raises a very interesting question. One, what is the threshold for interest rates that would result in concerns about unstable fiscal dynamics? That's an interesting question. At what point do the central banks have to resist that because of financial stability reasons? And then, of course, what that means, the implication of that, is that the central banks may actually have to go soft on inflation. They might have to, have those financial stability risks in mind when they think about monetary policy. And if that's the case, will financial markets then start to demand compensation for the risk of future interest rate increases and so on? And so this is very interesting because Brad Setzer had some really nice comments last night in response to Robin's blog, where he shows that basically the Japanese authorities are sitting on 1.2 trillion dollars, US dollars, that can be used to defend and so on. So one of the things we're looking into is going back to countries big countries where they fought the fundamentals with lots of reserves but not having an inconsistent policy strategy like what we're describing with Japan, where you're potentially trying to keep the interest rate low. So this is based on the assumption that obviously if inflation were to get to 2%, obviously there has to be an adjustment in the interest rate. Now that, of course, is a scenario. But under that scenario, the policy doesn't look very consistent with keeping longer term interest rates capped. That's why, of course, they've abandoned the the cap on the 10-year bond rate and so on. So the question is, how much do interest rates have to adjust up? What are the risks to financial stability? Should the central bank be concerned about those risks to financial stability? And if they are, what implications do you have for the exchange rate? And then, of course, inflation and so on.